thanks everyone for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Brock today. He's giving a seminar on non-compliance in marine reserves. So Brock's originally from the U.S. and what we affectionately call the flyover states. That's anywhere in the middle of the country. But Brock got his degree in, I guess, biology and a minor in justice studies, right? And so it's a branch of sociology. So he's really got a very interdisciplinary background from the start. Now, Brock was one of, I guess he was doing a master's in the marine biology department, and kept bothering me about supervising his master's degree, and he just kept saying, would you please supervise it? And I kept just saying no. And so I don't know if you guys know much about Judaism, but to convert to Judaism, you have to be told 3 times, no, you can't. And so finally on the 4th time, Brock came to me and said, you're going to supervise my PhD, my master's degree. I said, okay, great. And he did a fantastic job on it, and he actually published that paper in Fish and Fisheries, and was very keen afterwards to work with Gary and I on a PhD. And as a result, we recruited several others, including Terry and Dave Willey and Steve Sutton as well. And his thesis is a really interesting blend of the different social science and ecological disciplines relating to this really important issue of compliance. So without further ado, Brock, thanks so much. Good luck.
So, thanks everyone for coming today. I'm going to talk to you about non-compliance in marine reserves. And before we start this, I just want to talk a little bit about compliance in general. And compliance isn't something that you often think of unless you're me and you're thinking of it every day. But a good example of this is the fact that everyone drove here to work today. Almost everyone drove to work. And the thing that you may not have thought about is that your ability to get here safely actually required everyone else to follow or comply with the same traffic laws that you did. And a lot of the times that we start to think about compliance is only when we see the consequences of non-compliance, right? So an example of this would be a drink driving accident. And then all of a sudden people start talking about drink driving and the laws that are around it. And so the third point I want to make about compliance is that many people often have really simple ideas on how we can solve this. And a really great example of this is with drink driving. So early efforts to reduce drink driving typically focused on either increasing the penalties around it or the likelihood of getting caught. But the real progress has only been seen recently when social marketers went out and campaigned to change the social norm around drink driving and make it socially unacceptable behavior. So with those few points in mind, I'm going to talk to you specifically today about non-compliance in marine reserves. And I just want to say that the definition I'm using for non-compliance in this case is fishing, whether intentional or unintentional, inside a green zone. So the way my talk's going to go today, I'm going to briefly tell you about the importance of compliance, and then I'm going to tell you about measuring compliance and understanding the drivers of compliance. So these are the 2 critical components to understanding compliance in itself. And this bar here will let you see where we go with the progress. So there's numerous ecological consequences of compliance. First being that ecological outcomes diminish when non-compliance occurs. Here in the Great Barrier Reef, more sharks have been observed in well-enforced no-entry zones compared to no-take zones. And the main attributed point here is that there's poaching occurring in these green zones. Second point I'd like to make is that short bursts of non-compliance can really negate the cumulative effect of decades of protection. And in Indonesia, researchers saw more than a 50% reduction in fish biomass in less than 4 years in a no-take marine reserve. So this is happening very quickly and can have devastating effects. Moving on to the social consequences of compliance, of which there are many, but I'm going to briefly touch on a few here. First being that free riding or other people poaching and not getting punished for it can undermine the broader support of everyone else. So if I see somebody poaching and they're getting away with it, why am I going to follow the rule? And this can potentially occur to the point where poaching becomes socially acceptable, and that will hinder your future management efforts. And finally, the reduced ecological outcomes due to poaching can damage resource-dependent livelihoods like tourism operators or commercial or subsistence fishers. So hopefully by this point, I've illustrated that compliance is important for marine reserves specifically. And the next point I want to make is that compliance is something that needs to be considered much more often in the primary literature. And to do this, I went out and quickly did a Web of Science search using search terms down here on the x-axis and the number of studies as a just general proxy measurement of whether or not this is an interesting subject to marine reserve researchers. So when you look at marine reserve size, there's almost 6,000 publications that have been published in this topic. You look at age, you have well over 4,000 and closer to 5,000. You look at marine reserve design and location, you're still well over 2,000. But finally, once you get to compliance, you have that little blip there, which is actually 162 studies. So this is something that really has not been looked at in the primary literature that often. And one of the potential reasons for this is the fact that compliance is an inherently difficult thing to measure. It's an illegal activity. If I'm somebody that's poaching, I'm sure as hell not going to tell anyone that I'm going out and poaching. So with that in mind, I believe that this area here is where we need some contributions in the future. So again, I'm going to talk to you about my thesis, which is around two critical components of compliance, that of measuring compliance, and secondly, how we understand the drivers. So moving into the measuring component, there are numerous methods that exist which we can use to measure compliance in marine reserves. These include biological proxies, such as changes in fish behavior, or size structure, or even biomass relative to the expected values. Secondly, you have law enforcement records, which can tell you the number of violations, potentially where they're occurring. The thing to remember here is that law enforcement records are not necessarily complete measurements of compliance because there's this discretionary bias of the sanctioning agent and whether or not they're going to sanction someone or not. Thirdly, you have remote monitoring. Now, this can take place with numerous instruments, whether they be acoustic buoys, satellite, radar, or even drones, which are becoming recently very popular. Now, this next measure of direct observation is really the only direct measurement of compliance. And simply put, it can be done from the air, from the shore, or from another vessel. But the issue with direct observation is it requires a lot of man hours to be out there. And I don't know anyone else that wants to sit out on Orpheus Island for weeks on end trying to catch a poacher in the act, right? And finally, you have indirect observation, or surveys of discarded fishing gears inside these closed areas. And while all of these methods are really good for telling us whether or not compliance is occurring, they don't answer the critical question of why compliance is occurring. So to do that, you need to rely on either expert opinion or what I've termed direct questioning or social surveys. So now that I've told you about these methods, let's look at the breakdown of the usage of them in the primary literature. Sorry, and one more point I should make is that this highlighted changes in fish behavior is just to mention the fact that this has been researched as far as fish behavior changing in relation to fishing pressure, but it has not yet been used to actually infer something about compliance or whether compliance is, non-compliance in this case, is occurring. So, in a previous project that I performed, I did a systematic review of all of the articles in the primary literature that estimated compliance levels. And there's two main points that I want to make here. First being that everything in gray is a qualitative estimate. So the vast majority of all the estimated compliance levels in literature have been either anecdotal or post hoc explanations of potentially why biomass wasn't as high as it could have been, right? The second point I want to make is that everything here in black, which is a quantitative estimate, most of these studies, in fact 95% of them, use one single method to go out and measure compliance. And I'll tell you that each method is likely to have biases, and it's really limited in the information it can provide to managers or other people that are going to go and address these issues. So this brings me to the first research gap that I've identified, and that being that there's no real understanding of whether systematic biases exist among different measurement methods. And the general research question that I've asked to address this gap is how can the prevalence of poaching be measured given its cryptic nature? Now moving on to the second section of my thesis, or that of understanding the drivers of compliance. Now, numerous disciplines have previously explored why people fail to comply or what influences their behavior. So in wildlife biology, researchers have gone and documented the motivations for people to poach. In environmental criminology, researchers have recently suggested that you view poaching as a form of social or political protest against an illegitimate regulation. And finally, in social psychology, researchers often use the theory of planned behavior to try to understand the predeterminants or what influences an individual's behavior. So, the point I want to make here is that each of these disciplines have a specific methodology and the language or terminology, and finally a perspective or scale that they use to look at compliance or to look at human behavior. And because, in my mind, understanding compliance in a marine reserve is understanding human behavior in a complex social ecological system, I believe that we need to integrate these different traditional approaches to really understand the question in a holistic way. So to this end, I've identified 3 traditional approaches or theoretical foundations that we can use to explore this further. Those being the rational choice, the normative approach, and finally the institutional approach with a multidisciplinary aim of there where the X is. So the rational choice approach is based on the idea of rational actors. A rational actor in this case being somebody who weighs the costs and benefits of performing that behavior and acts in their own interest. Now this is grounded in microeconomic models of behavior and formally introduced in compliance of criminology studies in 1968 by Gary Becker. He went on to actually win the Nobel Prize for this work, so it's certainly been groundbreaking. And rational choice theory, or the rational choice approach, is the foundation of deterrence theory in criminology. And this is something that most people are probably familiar with, as most of the law enforcement approaches are based on it. And these approaches posit that there's 2 general ways to influence behavior. First being to increase the penalty, or the likelihood of being caught, and secondly, to change the rewards to these people doing these undesirable behaviors. So ivory poaching in Africa is becoming a very large topic, and everyone has probably heard of it. One of the ways that they've been trying to reduce it is to devalue ivory, or to make it so there's not as large of a reward for people to go out and poach. Now, rational choice provides a strong background when poaching is financially motivated. However, it does not consider moral or social obligations. And finally, these law enforcement approaches based on rational choice often have perverse outcomes, or situations in which sanctioning can actually increase crime. Like I told you earlier, researchers in environmental criminology have been using defiance theory, or recommending that we use defiance theory, to view when sanctions will increase crime and whether it's a form of social and political protest. So, in all, rational choice theory is a very good start for examining people's behavior, but in itself it's incomplete and needs to be further expanded upon. And I just want to leave you with the words of Daniel Kahneman, another Nobel laureate, this time in cognitive psychology, who stated that people's beliefs, wishes, and hopes are not always anchored in reason. And finally, we move on to the normative approach. And the normative approach looks at how social norms influence people's behaviors. The norm in this case being a perceived standard of behavior. It could be either social or personal, or another word for personal would just be the moral obligation. Now, the theory of planned behavior, which I mentioned before, has been used very often in social psychology because it's one of the most powerful models to actually explain variance related to people's behavior. So with an endpoint of behavior, behavior is thought to be modified or moderated by the intention, in this case to poach or not to poach. And the intention is assumed to have 3 predeterminants, that being the subjective norm, or how society views poaching, the attitudes, or that person's individual view about poaching, and finally their perceived control, or their ease of poaching. So while this is a really good start, the focus here is on the individual, or the micro scale. And it generally doesn't address these larger macro-level influences. So to address these macro-level influences, we need to move towards an institutional approach, which with the main assumption here in the institutional approach is that people's behaviors are profoundly influenced by institutions. Now, an institution is a formal or an informal rule that governs people's interactions. So, the point I need to make here as well is that an organization is not necessarily an institution. So, Gabrampa is an organization, and their spatial zoning rules or laws are therefore the institution that they have put in place to guide behavior. So, if you take an institutional approach to individual behavior, you have your behavior as your endpoint, and you can look at things such as user characteristics. These can include wealth, or education, or leadership. And most importantly, it allows you to look at the governance system. Now, the governance system, there are numerous conditions that may foster individual behavior. These include operational rules, once again, like spatial zoning here on the Great Barrier Reef, or collective choice rules, which allow people to manage their resources together. And finally, there's also the perceived legitimacy of that governance system. And the last point here is that traditional institutional approaches assume that actors are rational and that they do not integrate people's attitudes, beliefs, or values, which I just told you are fairly important in influencing behavior. So to this end, I've been developing a framework that integrates the institutional characteristics here with the individual behavioral characteristics here from the theory of planned behavior. And I've modified the theory of planned behavior to include personal norms, as they're very likely to be, very likely to explain variance in someone's behavior in this case. I'll come back to this framework a little bit later, but I just wanted to show it to you all so you could get a brief glimpse. So this brings me to research gap number 2, being that few studies have explored the drivers of people's compliance decisions regarding marine reserves. And those studies that have to date have either investigated compliance decisions using a normative or an institutional approach. So the general research question I've asked to address this knowledge gap is what influences or drives people's compliance decisions. And that's what I'll be doing in chapters 3 and 4. So these are the research questions, each specific to a chapter that I have developed to answer the 2 general research questions. And I'm not going to read them out loud now, but I'll address each one as I go through my methods. So in chapter 1, the aim of this chapter is to verify novel compliance measurement methods. And the specific research question I have is, can changes in targeted fish behavior, or flight initiation distance, and accumulated fishing lines in no-take marine reserves be used as a proxy measure of compliance? And the study sites I've picked to investigate this question are the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park in Hawaii, mostly because they're in developing countries where they speak English and they have fairly well-developed management systems in place already. So it wouldn't make any sense to go out and try to look at this in a paper park where absolutely nothing works. Again, as I said, the method that I'll be using is comparisons of changes in fish behavior and discarded fishing gears. And firstly, we're going to apply this on 30 different sites in the inshore island groups of the Great Barrier Reef between the Palms and the Whitsundays. Now, the way I'm going to assess these measures is to look at the consistency, the bias, the applicability, the costs, and finally the implications for management, or whether this is something that could be used in the real world to measure or infer compliance. Now, the field work for this is ongoing, and I'll first talk about the discarded fishing gears. So we cleaned and researched. This basically entails cleaning a site and coming back and resurveying the accumulated line, both inside the reserve and outside the reserve. And on the Great Barrier Reef, we first cleaned these sites in 2012 and resurveyed in 2014. In Hawaii, I plan on cleaning sites in 2015 and resurveying in 2016. The reason being a single year's duration in Hawaii, because there's really high fishing pressure. So we assume that there will be a lot of accumulated line in these areas. As for flight initiation distance, this has 3 real components before it can be used to infer anything about compliance. And firstly, that's just testing to see if flight initiation distance changes on a targeted predatory fish here on the Great Barrier Reef. Secondly, we need to determine the speed, the magnitude, and the duration of altered behavior. And thirdly, you need to measure the flight initiation distance on the same sites that I had spoken of earlier. Now, the analysis I plan on using includes the boosted regression trees, which are really good at incorporating or handling nonlinearity and any sort of interacting factors between your covariates. Once I've addressed or identified what the more important values or variates are, I'm going to use either GLIMs or GAMs to further investigate how much variance is explained by this. And finally, I'm going to use multidimensional scaling to determine whether or not there's any differences in fishing line or in fish behavior in between these two regions. So some of the progress to date that I've had here in Chapter 1, I've gotten my animal ethics approved, the Queensland Fisheries permit's been approved, and I've also gained access to Bronco enforcement records, which will allow me to really ground truth and see if the records that these guys have are really lining up with what I'm getting while I'm in the water. And finally, my Bronco permit application is also under consideration. Now, in flight initiation distance, this first component that I mentioned, I have demonstrated that there is a significant difference in Plectocomus leopardus behavior between no-take and fish areas. And to do this, we visited 18 reefs in total, in the Swains and in the Cairns outer reef section, and we looked at 6 no-entry, 6 no-take, and 6 fish areas. And the large take-home result I want you to see is that in the no-take and no-entry areas, you had a flight initiation distance of around 1 meter, or you could get within 1 meter of a trout before it took off and swam away. When you get into a fish zone, it's almost up to 200 meters. So this is almost twice the amount of approach distance. But as of yet, I've yet to determine the speed, magnitude, and duration of the altered behavior, and finally to measure this on those inshore island sites. As far as the discarded fishing gear counts go, I mentioned earlier that we surveyed and removed line from 30 sites in 2012. Just this year, we resurveyed the same sites. And the big finding here was that there was really no difference in accumulated line between fish and no-take zones. And in the Whit-Sundays, poaching seemed to be fairly widespread, especially near these public moorings. The story when you get to the palms is a bit more difficult to disentangle, but the poaching efforts for the most part were concentrated on specific sites, and a lot of these sites were sites that held a lot of fish biomass or were kind of around the corner and out of the way from where everyone else would see you. And the last point I need to make here about the palms data set is that there's certainly the potential for inflated accumulation rates due to the fact that Palm Islanders have native title, so they can legally fish in these green zones. And secondly, that researchers can also fish in these same green zones. But the take-home point I want you to remember is that considerable amounts of poaching are occurring in these areas that were once thought to be among the best enforced on the Great Barrier Reef. Moving on to Chapter 2, my research question is how do estimates of compliance from different social survey techniques compare? And I'm going to use 4 different methods to try to get estimates of people's compliance levels. First being self-administration, or simply put, handing someone an iPad with a sensitive question, asking them to answer it in a way that I'll never know what their specific answer is. This is to reduce the social desirability, which is the main bias around any of these survey techniques. Secondly, I'll be asking about the perceived compliance levels of others rather than themselves. And then I'll be using both the random response technique and the unmatched count technique. And while I'm not going to go into depth on each of these techniques, what they are is they're designed to use randomizing devices that reduce the incentive for people to lie about their activities due to social desirability. And so in the unmatched count technique, you use a randomizing device, whether you're going to hand somebody a control card, which does not have the sensitive behavior, or the treatment card, which does have the sensitive behavior. And very briefly to explain how you can then estimate the prevalence from that, is you can compare the means of the two, because you're asking someone, how many of these activities do you do? You're not asking them to identify what activities they do. And then you're asking the same question here. So the assumption is that the difference in means will actually allow you to go back and estimate the prevalence of that behavior for the whole community, right? So to do this, I've picked once again the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and that being the central region. So I'm going to ask or obtain quantitative estimates of compliance levels with each of these methods. And I'm going to use boat ramp surveys in Hinchinbrook, Townsville, and Airlie Beach to get compliance estimates for the Palm Islands and the Whitsunday Islands, right? And the analysis that I'm going to be using here is just that of descriptive stats to determine whether a specific method is overestimating or underestimating compliance relative to these other methods. So, moving on to Chapter 3, the specific research question I have here is how are recreational fishers' zoning compliance decisions related to both norms and institutional conditions? Again, I'll be investigating this in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park in Hawaii. I'll be using quantitative social surveys with that integrated predictive framework that I've developed so far. I'm aiming for approximately 500 surveys in each location, because this is what a preliminary power analysis suggested. And again, it'll be at boat ramps of Hinchinbrook, Townsville, and Airlie Beach. And I also plan to back this data up with qualitative surveys of key informants or tourism operators, for instance, in the Whitsundays. See whether or not the estimates of compliance are backing up or matching that of what people see on the water. So to get into the integrated framework that I'll be using, first off, my end measure will be behavior, and in this case it'll be self-reported behavior, because this is the only way that you can get an individual measure of behavior, rather than the other techniques which give you a community level or a percentage of the community that is either poaching or not poaching. So I'm going to institute or incorporate the institutional design factors, including the governance system or perceived legitimacy, user characteristics, including leadership. I'm also going to look at the intention for someone to poach or not, the personal norms, whether they be environmental or altruistic, social norms, for example, the injunctive social norm, which is whether or not this is a socially acceptable behavior. I'll be looking at attitudes, and specifically in this case, each person's or each individual's attitude towards the act of poaching, or a cost-benefit analysis, if you remember from the rational choice theory. And finally, I'll be looking at perceived control, or personal capabilities. And this is the skills and the access to the resource, or to go and effectively poach. The analysis I'll be using here, firstly, is general linear mixed models, with behavior as my response variable, and the rest of my covariates as predictor variables. Now there's a good chance that some of these covariates are going to be related, and if that's the case, I'll be using boosted regression trees or path analysis to actually determine what the causal relationships between these variables are. Finally, moving on to Chapter 4, I'm asking the question, how are artisanal fishers' compliance decisions related to norms and institutional design and co-managed marine reserves? And to do this, I'm going to look at 25 co-managed marine reserves from 5 countries throughout the Indo-Pacific, using roughly 900 household surveys of perceived compliance levels. So once again, to break down my predictive framework and how I'm going to measure these different factors, the end point of the measure of behavior here is perceived compliance of others. Going to look at the governance system once again, example of one of these characteristics being perceived legitimacy. Also going to look at user characteristics like leadership. I'm going to look at social norms, and in this case, whether people decided to confront observed poachers or not, the attitudes, whether there's perceived benefits from the reserves, and finally the perceived control, or an individual's reason for reporting observed poachers, again, or not. Now in this case, it's not possible to investigate personal norms or intention, but I plan on really investigating more of the governance system characteristics here. Again, analysis being GLIMs, boosted regression trees, and path analysis for the reasons that I earlier described. So for my progress to date, in Chapters 3 and 4, I've had approval of human ethics, thanks to Renee and Steve. I've developed this predictive framework. I recently received a Gebrumpa Science for Management Award, and that's going to be used to buy iPads to facilitate these social surveys. And finally, the data has been collected for Chapter 4. I'm briefly going to run over my timeline. The main point I want you to take away from here is the fact that most of my field work has been planned for the first 2 years, with the exception of a couple more months of field work in the third year if needed. And I plan on presenting my results, some of my results at the ICCB symposium next year in France. So, moving on to my budget. Everything here that I've listed in red has already been spent, and the rest of my estimated expenses have already been covered by my supervisors, thankfully. I've also identified risks to achieving my objectives. And while I'm not going to go over all the writing on this slide, I've identified 4 major risks, and I've also developed preventative and recovery measures that will help me, manage these risks appropriately. And finally, I'm going to leave you with my planned publications. And at this time, I'd welcome any questions that anyone has.
Any questions from the audience? Yeah.
I like that you're using different methods for the social surveys to test compliance. It'll be interesting to see what you get from that. But did you say 500 surveys from each region?
Yes.
That's a lot.
It is.
Thank you.
So you may not have seen it on the budget, but we have incorporated expenses for hiring research assistants, which will greatly help my data collection.
Right. Sorry, each region being, one would be Australia, one would be Hawaii,
Yes,
rather than each boat ramp.
not 500 at each.
Yeah. Sorry, not each boat ramp. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
So in your first chapter, you're using 2 pretty indirect measures of non-compliance.
Right.
And you're just comparing them to each other.
Right.
So, and you also said that there are considerable amounts of poaching are occurring. So you've got some certainty about that.
Right. So I mean, the reason I'm saying considerable amounts of poaching are occurring is because in these areas, and Whitsunday specifically, we cleaned all these sites in 2012. And so we came back 2 years later, and when we resurveyed the sites, there was absolutely no difference in the amount of line accumulated in the blue zones compared to the green zones. So line accumulating in these green zones, I'm fairly confident, in fact extremely confident, that it's not drifting in from elsewhere. So this shows that people are fishing or attempting to fish in the green zones. And now, if the issue is with the definition of poaching, which is the removal of fish from a reserve, they may not be poaching. They may be amateurs that are poaching off the back of yachts and not catching much. But from a management perspective, I don't think this matters because people are still fishing in these areas that are supposed to be closed. Is there anything else you want me to expand upon there, or something that you're specifically looking for an answer to?
So, yeah, are you comparing those 2 methods then to the Grumper records? Or?
Yeah, so I'll use the Grumper records. They obviously don't have detail down to those specific site levels, but I'll be able to look at the Palm Island or the Whitsunday group and look at the infractions that have been occurring there. And now none of these are going to be directly comparable. But one of the points I wanted to make was that each of these methods that we use can provide some information and not others. So if you look at discarded fishing gear, that's great. That tells you whether or not people are using hook and line in a reserve. That tells you absolutely nothing if somebody's going in with a spear gun. And it tells you nothing because pros are often not going to lose the line there. So you lose some of that detail if you're not investigating compliance using these numerous methods, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess that's what I was trying to cover there is by using those 2 methods with the cooperation of Grumpa's enforcement records, you can really get an idea of what the compliance levels are and what's occurring in these areas.
So you'd also expect the flight initiation distance would be, well, I'm not sure if that other works country, but is more affected by, divers and spearfishing,
Correct.
Less affected by line fishing.
Yep.
So your 2 methods are, looking at really different.
Yeah, so they're fairly complementary. So some research has been done on flight initiation distance with fishing line surveys, and Dave Ferry was doing some of this research, and he looked at areas where spearfishing was allowed, line fishing was allowed, and then spearfishing and line fishing. And they're still seeing an increase in flight initiation distance in the areas that were only open to line fishing. So this, while it's not the same extent or magnitude of change, it's still occurring. And just one more point about that is when we were in the Swain, when I did this study in the Swain, it's a really appropriate area because there's not a lot of spearfishing pressure out there. It's 150 nautical miles from shore. And they do get, on average, 3 or 4 spearfishing companies that do big trips out there. But the amount of reefs that are out there, I'm fairly confident that they probably weren't on the same reefs that we were surveying. So that's basically, and I didn't show the results there because that was just my overall results, but in the Swains we actually saw a significant difference in fish behavior in the blue zones compared to the green zones, and then again in the green zones compared to pink zones. So to me the Swains represents more of an area without the influence of humans, especially spearfishers, and we still demonstrated that there are significant changes in trout behavior in these areas.
Great. Any other questions?
Fire away, Renee.
Sorry. In the Whitsunday, they're going to be talking to the about Charles.
Yes, so that was the tourism operators that I was hoping to talk to. Well, the tourism operators being ocean rafting. There's also the potential to talk to the bareboat operators as well.
They're the ones that are using the moorings the most.
Yep.
That's very funny.
Yeah, but I had an anecdotal conversation with one of the guys that is involved with the bareboat chartering business, and he said by the time you get to anything about zoning, these people are fairly well inundated with information because a lot of them don't even know how to sail properly, and so it could very well be it might be a good information or a good source of information, but I'm not sure as to how enlightening that information is going to be from some of those crews. So
Yeah.
Adrian.
You mentioned that you're going to measure compliance levels. What's the definition of a compliance level?
Compliance levels and what? So
is it the number of people? Is it the number of people per area, per time?
So I'll be looking at
efficient effort.
So I'll be looking at firstly compliance levels. It'll be all basically percentages. So the perceived level will be percentages, perceived levels of others. And then with random response technique, as you well know, and the unmatched count technique, you get an overall estimate of the population and the prevalence. So say 10% of people poach. But with the self-administration, that'll allow us to look at all of the covariates that I identified earlier. And at the same time, we can check to see if self-administration results scale up to those other community level results that are currently accepted, I guess, as far as being more accurate.
So compliance levels would be pretty much the number of people engaged in illegal fishing, and you're not going to measure effort.
Effort?
So,
yeah, I mean, let's say...
So like the intensity of it, right? So you might be able to get to 10% of the people poach, but you don't know whether those 10% go every day and poach or once a year. I think that's what you're getting at, right? Yeah.
Right, and that's the issue. You could potentially put a question like that in the survey, but the best way to actually do that would be to get a hold of the identities of these people that are non-compliers or offenders and survey them specifically to get at how often they're doing it, the reasons for doing it, but so far we've been unable to gain access to those records. So
the other question that I have, and I haven't thought much about this, when you talk about the flight initiation distance, and if you're going to sample fished and unfished areas, or at least areas where you can't fish, like a pink zone, for example, or a green zone, I'm thinking that the home range of the species that you choose is really relevant. So, for example, if, let's say, the green zone is here and the blue zone is here, and the distance from this location is within the home range of that species, you might be sampling the same fish.
Yeah, it's possible.
I don't know if I'm making any sense, but...
No, it's certainly possible, and that's one of the other measurements, or one of the other statistical measurements or measures that I've put into place. So it's included in the analysis. And preliminary data analysis that I've done has not suggested that the distance to the nearest fish reef has any impact, the distance to the nearest population center or anything like that. Now, I haven't incorporated specific home range information yet, and it's certainly possible that, you know, one fish or a few of these fish could be moving from one to the other, but I attempted to increase my replication level. So at each of these reefs, we're surveying 25 trout and 25 keats, and that gave us a fairly large sample size to be able to make the conclusions that I did.
With your green zone locations within the Whitsundays, have you given consideration to the amount of tourism use that's there that may impact upon your flight response?
It certainly could, yeah. I've yet to really delve into that, but that is certainly something that I should consider. I'm not aware if there's information available about the total amount of tourism usage.
There is.
You're nodding, so that's good. So I'd like to talk to you after this. Anyone else?
Okay, let's put our hands together. Rob, thanks, guys.